In Patricia Duncan's lavish mansion, a 72-year-old widow was about to ignite a family crisis. What started as an elegant bridal shower took a shocking turn when they came face to face with the consequences of a 7-word message that would expose years of hidden resentment. Helen Williams wasn't your typical grandmother. For over 4 decades, she had spent her life teaching mathematics and carefully managing finances, known for her practical wisdom and selfless generosity that masked a growing inner turmoil. When they encountered predatory expectations circling her dwindling savings account, they had no idea they were sparking a confrontation that would upend 3 generations. Helen's simple gift tag inscription, "From the ATM who's funding this," would lead to an explosive reckoning that threatened to destroy her granddaughter's wedding and expose the fractures beneath their family's facade. What began as a desperate act of rebellion would become an unexpected path to healing. The Williams-Reynolds-Chen families would never be the same after discovering that the true cost of celebration wasn't measured in dollars, but in honest conversations about love, sacrifice, and the complex balance between giving and self-preservation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Helen Williams stood at her kitchen window, watching a cardinal flit between the branches of the maple tree in her backyard. Sunday afternoon light filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across her well-tended garden. The kettle whistled behind her, its pitch rising until she turned to silence it. Earl Grey, Frank's favorite, 5 years since his passing, and she still made tea for 2 on Sundays. The doorbell chimed, pulling Helen from her ritual. She wasn't expecting visitors. Her arthritic fingers smoothed her cardigan as she made her way through the living room, past walls lined with decades of family photos, Diana's graduation, Cassie's, softball tournaments, Frank holding up a prized trout from their last anniversary trip to Minnesota. "Coming," she called, voice carrying the measured calm of someone who'd spent 40 years commanding high school classrooms. The bell rang again, more insistent this time. Helen recognized that particular impatience before she even opened the door. Cassie stood on the porch, practically vibrating with contained excitement. James Chen stood a half step behind her, his expression carrying the careful politeness Helen had come to appreciate in the 2 years he'd been dating her granddaughter. "Grandma!" Cassie burst through the doorway, enveloping Helen in a cloud of expensive perfume. "We have news!" Helen caught James's eye over Cassie's shoulder. His smile seemed genuine, if a touch reserved. Always the observer, this one. So different from Cassie's previous boyfriends, who'd seemed to fill any room with ego and empty charm. Come in," Helen ushered them inside. "I was just making tea." James waited for both women to enter before following, closing the door, with deliberate quietness. His eyes swept the living room, taking in the modest furnishings, the carefully arranged books, the mathematics awards Helen had earned during her teaching career. "Is Mom here yet?" Cassie asked, glancing around. "Your mother?" Helen's eyebrows lifted. "I didn't know Diana was coming." "I texted her to meet us here at 4, Cassie replied, checking her watch. "We wanted to tell you both together, but I couldn't wait another minute." She thrust her left hand forward, where a modest solitaire diamond caught the afternoon light. "We're engaged," James said, his voice carrying the measured tempo of someone who thought carefully before speaking. For a moment, Helen felt nothing but pure joy. After watching Diana's marriage to Ryan disintegrate in bitter arguments about money and responsibility, Helen had privately wondered if Cassie would ever trust enough to marry. Yet here she was, glowing and hopeful, with a young man who seemed to genuinely care for her. "That's wonderful news," Helen said, clasping her hands together. "When did this happen?" "Last night," James answered, his hand finding the small of Cassie's back. "I had planned—" "He proposed at sunset on the pier," Cassie interrupted, leaning into him. It was perfect. Helen noticed how James's expression flickered, a momentary twitch at the corners of his mouth. The math teacher in her had spent decades reading micro-expressions across classroom desks. Something in Cassie's version wasn't quite accurate. "Let me get you both some tea," Helen said, moving toward the kitchen. "And I think I have some cookies from the bakery." In the kitchen, Helen added a third cup to the tray, her mind already calculating. A wedding. Her only granddaughter. Of course she'd want to contribute. Frank and she had always talked about helping when this day came, back when such an occasion seemed comfortably distant. When she returned, Cassie was already deep in wedding plans. "We're thinking next June," she explained, accepting a teacup from Helen. "Which means we need to book everything immediately." 9 months seems reasonable, Helen agreed, pleased by the timeline. Nothing too rushed, nothing too extravagant. "I've been researching venues for ages," Cassie continued, opening her designer handbag. Helen caught James's barely perceptible eye roll. "Lakeside Manor has an opening for the second Saturday in June, and they're holding it until Tuesday." Helen's teacup paused midway to her lips. Lakeside Manor was where the mayor's daughter had gotten married last year. The event had consumed 4 pages in the local newspaper, with mentions of imported orchids and ice sculptures. That sounds... Helen searched for a neutral word. Impressive. James cleared his throat softly. "It's one of several options. We're considering." "It's the perfect venue," Cassie stated with quiet finality, reaching into her bag. "I brought the brochure to show you." She handed Helen a glossy pamphlet featuring an antebellum mansion overlooking manicured grounds that swept down to a crystalline lake. Helen flipped through the pages, her mathematician's brain automatically calculating as she noticed the pricing structure. The basic package started at $28,000, before catering, flowers, or photography. "Beautiful," Helen murmured, her voice steadier than she felt. The doorbell rang again, announcing Diana's arrival. When Helen opened the door, her daughter stood clutching a bottle of champagne, her smile a practiced curve that didn't quite reach her eyes. At 50, Diana still carried herself with the polished poise that had once made her the town's top-selling real estate agent, before the divorce, before the market crashed, before Ryan traded her in for his 29-year-old assistant. "Did I miss the big news?" Diana asked, air-kissing Helen's cheek. "They just told me," Helen replied, accepting the champagne. French. Expensive. Helen wondered which credit card Diana had stretched for this purchase. Diana swept into the living room, her voice rising to a pitch Helen recognized as her showing. A house beyond a client's budget tone. "Let me see the ring, sweetheart." As Cassie and Diana cooed over the engagement ring, Helen caught James watching her. His eyes, observant, careful, seemed to be measuring her reaction. Helen remembered Frank saying once that you could tell everything about a man by how he handled money. James had a good job as a software engineer, practical career, stable income. But something in his posture suggested discomfort with Cassie's enthusiastic wedding vision. Later, as they toasted with champagne in Helen's good crystal, the set she and Frank had received for their 40th anniversary, Helen found herself saying words that would echo in her mind for months to come. "I want to help with the wedding." "Costs," she announced, caught in the warm glow of celebration. "Frank and I always plan to contribute to your special day, Cassie." The room seemed to pause, and Helen caught 3 distinct reactions. Cassie's eyes widened with delight, Diana's shoulders relaxed a fraction, and James studied his champagne flute with sudden interest. "Grandma, that's so generous!" Cassie exclaimed, moving to hug her. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Helen replied, though a small voice, one that sounded remarkably like Frank's, whispered caution in the back of her mind. "What else am I saving for at my age?" Diana pulled Helen aside while Cassie showed James family photographs on the mantel. "Mom, you don't have to do this," she whispered, Cassie has expectations. Unlike some people, I've managed my money carefully, Helen replied, the barb slipping out before she could stop it. Diana flinched, and Helen immediately regretted the reference to her daughter's financial struggles after the divorce. I just don't want you to feel obligated, Diana said, recovering quickly, or for Cassie to take advantage. It's not taking advantage if I'm offering, Helen countered, straightening her shoulders. And I want to do this. By the time they left, Cassie already texting wedding ideas to her maid of honor Olivia, Diana driving them all back to the city, Helen found herself alone in the kitchen. She stood before the refrigerator where a magnet held a photo of Frank, taken 3 months before the heart attack that left her a widow at 67. Did I just make a terrible mistake? She asked the photograph. Frank's eyes crinkled at the corners, eternally amused by something just beyond the camera's view. He had been the practical one, the math teacher who could stretch $1 and find the flaw in any financial proposal. Helen, the English literature teacher, had been more susceptible to emotional appeals. That night, Helen lay awake in the darkness, calculating figures in her head. The venue alone would consume nearly 1/3 of her annual income from pension and investments combined. Add catering, flowers, photography, attire. She estimated the total would approach her entire yearly budget. The travel brochures for New Zealand, the trip she and Frank had planned for their retirement, the journey she had promised herself she would still take in his memory, sat in her bedside drawer, gathering dust. I'll talk to Diana tomorrow, she whispered to the ceiling, about setting some reasonable limits. But even as she made the resolution, Helen recognized the creeping dread that accompanied it. The certainty that in the battle between fiscal responsibility and her granddaughter's expectations, her carefully managed nest egg would become the inevitable casualty. Just consider it an investment in the experience, Miranda Hastings said, tapping a manicured nail against the glossy catalog. Your guests won't remember standard centerpieces, but they'll talk about custom-designed floral sculptures for years. Helen's fingers tensed around her pen as she jotted down the new figure, $6,800 for centerpieces alone, nearly triple what they'd initially budgeted. 3 months had passed since Cassie's engagement announcement, and what had started as a generous offer to help had morphed into something Helen barely recognized. The modest wedding fund she'd envisioned had expanded like a balloon filled past capacity, stretching thinner with each essential upgrade. They sat in Miranda's sleek downtown office surrounded by wedding magazines and sample books, Helen at one end of the glass conference table, Cassie and Diana huddled together at the other, their expressions mirroring each other's excitement. The wedding planner had started every suggestion with, if budget weren't a concern, then proceeded, as if it weren't. Mom, what do you think? Diana asked, though her tone suggested the question was mere formality. It seems excessive for something that will be discarded the next day, Helen ventured carefully. Miranda's smile didn't falter. Nothing is discarded, Mrs. Williams. We donate all florals to local hospitals afterward. It's actually quite charitable. See, Grandma, it's for a good cause, Cassie chimed in, squeezing Helen's arm. And the photographs will be exquisite. Helen nodded, swallowing the retort that actual charitable donations would be more efficient. This had become the pattern of their vendor meetings: gentle objection, swift dismissal, reluctant acquiescence. The math teacher in her kept running calculations, watching her retirement savings diminish with each decision. Now, about the menu tasting next week, Miranda continued, flipping to another tabbed section in her planner. Lakeside Manor's executive. Chef is proposing a 5-course dinner with wine pairings. There's a premium for the seasonal truffle option, but it really elevates the experience. Helen glanced at her own notebook, where she'd been tracking expenses. The venue deposit alone had been $20,000. Catering estimates had started at $65,000. Before the truffle upgrade, premium spirits package, or late-night snack station. Perhaps we could consider a slightly simpler menu, Helen suggested. 3 courses can be just as elegant. Diana's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom, this is Cassie's only wedding. We want it to be special. The implication hung in the air, unlike Diana's failed marriage to Ryan. Helen caught the flash of old pain in her daughter's eyes before Diana looked away, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. Of course, Helen conceded. I just want to be practical about the overall budget. Speaking of practical, Miranda interjected, we should discuss the photography package. The premium collection includes a second shooter, drone footage, and a custom-designed album. It's an additional $8,000, but the memories are priceless. Cassie's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and rolled her eyes. It's Aunt Patricia. Again, she answered, switching to speaker mode. Hi, Aunt Patricia. You're on speaker with Grandma, Mom, and Miranda, our wedding planner. Perfect timing. Patricia's voice filled the room, carrying the practiced warmth she reserved for public conversations. I was just speaking with Caroline Bennett at the club. Her daughter used Alexei Sorokin for her wedding photography last year. He's that Russian photographer who shoots for Vogue. He's magnificent, darling, and he happens to have an opening in June when one of his celebrity clients postponed. I've put in a good word for you. Helen's stomach tightened. Sorokin's name had appeared in the society pages of their local newspaper, attached to price tags that made the premium package look like a bargain. That's so thoughtful, Patricia, Diana responded, her voice rising to match her sister's artificial enthusiasm. We'll definitely look into it. After an excruciating hour of additional enhancements, Helen found herself at the reception desk, writing yet another check. This one for $15,000. Deposits for the florist, photographer, and videographer. Cassie chatted excitedly with Miranda about letterpress invitations while Diana scrolled through her phone. Grandma, we're heading back to the office, Cassie said, kissing Helen's cheek. Thank you for handling these deposits. I promise it will be the most beautiful wedding you've ever seen. Helen watched them leave, noticing how Diana's shoulders relaxed the moment the check was written. The weight had been transferred from her daughter's conscience to Helen's bank account. 20 minutes later, Helen pulled into Bethany Winter's driveway. Unlike the sterile modernity of Miranda's office, Bethany's home welcomed Helen with familiar comfort. Slightly worn furniture, shelves of well-read books, and the scent of fresh-baked cookies. That bad, huh? Bethany asked, taking one look at Helen's face as she opened the door. They'd been friends since their first year teaching together 40 years ago. Bethany in history, Helen in mathematics. No pretense needed. Worse, Helen replied, following Bethany to the sunroom where tea waited. 3 months of just one more thing, and we're now at nearly $80,000. Bethany let out a low whistle. For a wedding? Good Lord, Helen. That's more than my first house cost. Mine too, Helen said, sinking into the cushioned wicker chair. She pulled out her tablet and logged into her banking app. Look at this. Bethany adjusted her reading glasses, studying the screen. Your savings account balance has dropped by almost $50,000 since March. She looked up sharply. Helen Williams, tell me you're not spending your New Zealand fund on this wedding. Helen's silence was answer enough. Frank would have a conniption, Bethany stated bluntly. That trip was your dream together. Frank isn't here, Helen replied, a familiar ache spreading through her chest. And Cassie is. She lost so much. When Ryan left, her sense of family, her trust in relationships. This wedding means everything to her. No, Bethany countered, setting down her teacup with precision. This wedding means everything to Diana. This is her do-over through Cassie, and Patricia's involvement isn't helping matters. Helen sighed, rubbing her temples where a headache was forming. Patricia called during our meeting today to recommend some celebrity photographer. She hasn't offered a dime toward the costs, just expensive suggestions. Of course not, Bethany snorted. Patricia has spent 20 years competing with Diana. This is just another way to push her sister's buttons while looking generous. They sat in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun warming the room as birds flitted to Bethany's feeders outside. These quiet moments had sustained Helen after Frank's death, the unspoken understanding between two widows who'd built new lives alone. "Have you met with your financial advisor?" Bethany finally asked. "To see what this is actually doing to your retirement security?" "Not yet," Helen admitted. "I'm afraid of what he'll say." "And you should be," Bethany said, her tone softening. "Look, I understand wanting to help your granddaughter. When Malcolm died, I threw too much money at my grandkids, too. It felt good to be needed. But Henry and Susan never expected it. They were grateful, not entitled." She nodded toward the tablet. "That doesn't look like gratitude, Helen. That looks like a blank check." Helen stared out the window, watching a hummingbird hover near a feeder. So tiny, yet so precise in what it needed. "The thing is," Helen confessed, her voice barely audible, "I'm not sure Cassie even knows the real costs. James seems uncomfortable with the spending, which makes me wonder if she's keeping some details from him." Bethany's eyebrows shot up. "The groom doesn't know what his own wedding costs?" "I get the impression they've had disagreements about it. James comes from a family with very different values about money. His parents are immigrants who built everything from scratch." "Then perhaps," Bethany said, leaning forward, "you need to have a conversation with James instead of Diana or Cassie. Man's got a right to know what kind of financial decisions are being made in his name." Helen considered this, turning her wedding band, still worn after 5 years, around her finger. Frank would have done exactly that, gone straight to the source of reason in the situation. "You're right," Helen said finally. "But how do I approach him without seeming like I'm going behind Cassie's back?" "You'll find a way," Bethany assured her. "But first, answer me this, and be honest with yourself. Are you really prepared to spend your New Zealand fund? The trip you and Frank planned for 40 years? The dream you promised him you'd still take? On a one-day celebration that's growing more excessive by the minute?" Helen's throat tightened, as the question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer she wasn't ready to give. The memory of Frank's face as they'd pored over travel books together, planning their dream retirement, collided with Cassie's hopeful excitement. Past promises versus present obligations. "I need to talk to James," she said finally, "before this goes any further." Helen chose Riverside Cafe carefully, neutral territory, far enough from Cassie's office and James's tech campus to minimize the chance of running into mutual acquaintances. She arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the slow-moving river beyond the patio. The venue reminded her of places where she and Frank had planned their future together, coffee mugs between them, dreams still possible. James arrived precisely on time, his punctuality another trait Helen had come to appreciate. She'd texted him last night, a casual invitation to discuss a surprise for Cassie's wedding. Not entirely dishonest. Discovering someone shared your concerns often came as a surprise. "Mrs. Williams," James greeted her with a small bow of his head, a gesture Helen had noticed before, respect ingrained by his upbringing. "Helen, please," she reminded him, watching as he carefully arranged his napkin on his lap. "Thank you for making time in your workday." James's eyes moved briefly to his smartwatch. "I have a meeting at 2, but that gives us almost an hour." His smile was genuine but measured. "You mentioned a surprise for Cassie?" Helen took a deliberate sip of her water, choosing her approach. Direct, she decided. The math teacher in her still preferred clean equations to meandering narratives. "The surprise," she said carefully, "is that I wanted to speak with you privately about the wedding budget." James's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, then relaxed. "I see." I've noticed your discomfort during our vendor meetings, Helen continued. I thought perhaps we should compare notes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The barista delivered their order, a simple black coffee for James, a lavender tea for Helen. In the momentary interruption, Helen observed how James's composure never faltered, though something shifted in his eyes. My parents emigrated from Taiwan with 2 suitcases and $600, James said finally, wrapping his hands around the mug. They built a life through extreme caution with money. Extravagance wasn't part of my upbringing. Nor mine, Helen replied. Frank and I both taught public school for 40 years. We saved carefully, lived modestly. James nodded. My parents are concerned about the wedding. In our tradition, parents contribute, but they don't understand why everything needs to be so much. They offered $15,000, their entire savings for my marriage. I told them it wasn't necessary. Because Cassie and you are covering the costs? Helen asked, keeping her voice neutral. James's eyes sharpened, meeting hers directly. Because you are. He hesitated. Aren't you? The question hung between them as a flock of geese passed overhead, their shadow momentarily darkening the cafe patio. I agreed to help, Helen said carefully. I'm beginning to realize help means different things to different people. How much have you spent so far? James asked, his voice dropping lower. Helen pulled out her small notepad. Almost $80,000 in deposits alone. The current projected total is approaching $150,000. James nearly choked on his coffee. That's impossible. Cassie told me we were looking at $60,000 total, with you covering half. Helen watched realization dawn across his face. You didn't know. No. His voice tightened. I knew Cassie wanted her dream wedding. But these numbers. He shook his head. My annual salary is $90,000. This is more than my entire annual income, Helen finished for him. Does Cassie understand what she's asking of you? James's question contained no accusation, only genuine concern. I'm not sure she's asking anymore, Helen admitted. It seems assumed. 15 miles across town, Cassie sat across from her father at Terrazzo, an Italian restaurant where the menus listed no prices, a detail that hadn't escaped her notice. Ryan Reynolds ordered a second scotch, neat, while regaling her with stories about his recent Caribbean vacation with Stephanie, his new wife. The water there, Cass. Clearest blue you've ever seen, he enthused, his charm still evident at 52, despite the new lines around his eyes. You and James should honeymoon there. I know the manager could get you a deal. Cassie doubted. That. Her father's connections had always been more smoke than substance. It sounds lovely, Dad. Speaking of the wedding, Ryan continued, Stephanie and I are excited to be part of your big day. She's already bought a dress. Cassie swallowed. Her irritation. She'd sent the invitation to her father only. No +1 indicated. Of course he'd assume his 29-year-old wife was welcome. Actually, Dad, I wanted to talk to you about the wedding costs. Cassie's voice adopted the professional tone she used in marketing presentations. Grandma has been incredibly generous, but with your experience in luxury real estate, you understand that high-end venues come with significant expenses. Ryan's smile dimmed slightly. Of course, sweetheart. Your mother mentioned you selected Lakeside Manor. Beautiful property. Yes, and the deposits alone have been substantial. Cassie paused, assembling her dignity. I was hoping you might contribute to the costs. Ryan reached for his water glass, rings glinting on his manicured fingers. Well, sugar, you know I'd love to help, but with the twins starting private preschool and the renovations on the lake house. He trailed off, signaling the waiter for another drink, The twins. His replacement family. Cassie felt something cold settle in her stomach, a familiar sensation from childhood when Ryan would promise to attend her softball games, only to text last-minute cancellations. Even a small contribution would help, she persisted. Ryan sighed, pulling out his checkbook with practiced reluctance. Times are tight, but for you, princess. He wrote with a flourish, tearing out a check for $2,000. Will this help? $2,000. Not even enough to cover the calligrapher for the invitations. Cassie stared at the slip of paper, remembering the six-figure commission he'd bragged about over appetizers. Thank you, she managed, tucking the check into her wallet. It's very generous. Back at Riverside Cafe, Helen and James had reached a tentative understanding. I'll speak with Cassie, James promised. Tonight. There must be ways to have a beautiful wedding without these extravagant costs. Helen felt a weight lift from her shoulders. An ally. Someone who understood the value of money and the danger of misplaced priorities. I appreciate your discretion, she said. I don't want Cassie to feel I went behind her back. James nodded, his expression troubled. She has her heart set on a perfect wedding. I understand why. After watching her parents' marriage fail, she wants proof that we'll succeed where they didn't. But starting our marriage in debt isn't the answer. That evening, in the sleek downtown apartment Cassie and James shared, the conversation didn't go as planned. You went behind my back? Cassie's voice rose dangerously as she paced their kitchen. To my grandmother. I didn't go to her, James countered, his normally calm demeanor strained. She invited me to coffee to discuss the wedding. And you just happened to bring up money? Cassie's eyes flashed with hurt. Making me look like some gold digger taking advantage of my own grandmother? No one said that. James's voice remained level, though his jaw tightened. But Cassie, $150,000? That's beyond excessive. My parents built their life on less. Your parents, my grandmother, why is everyone so obsessed with what things cost? Tears formed in Cassie's eyes. My father gave me $2,000 today. $2,000, like I'm some distant relative he barely knows. James moved to comfort her, but Cassie stepped back. This is the one day where I get to feel special, she said, voice breaking. Where I prove that I'm not some child of divorce nobody wants to invest in. That our marriage matters. The marriage matters, James replied softly. The wedding is one day. A day I've dreamed about my entire life. Cassie grabbed her phone. I can't talk to you right now. You clearly don't understand what this means to me. She stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Through the thin walls, James heard her voice trembling as she called her mother. Mom? Cassie's tears broke through. James and Grandma are trying to ruin everything. Helen had just settled into her evening routine. Chamomile tea, crossword puzzle, the soft jazz Frank had loved playing low on the stereo, when headlights swept across her living room curtains. A car door slammed, then another. Voices carried. Through the quiet neighborhood darkness, one sharp and agitated, the other attempting a calming tone that did nothing to disguise its underlying tension. She knew who it was before the doorbell rang. Helen set down her crossword, straightened her cardigan, and took a steadying breath. Coming, she called, her voice carrying the forced evenness of someone preparing for battle. Diana and Cassie stood on her porch, their expressions mirror images of righteous indignation. Diana's BMW gleamed in the driveway, the luxury car payments Helen knew her daughter could barely afford. May we come in? Diana's question carried no actual inquiry, her foot already crossing the threshold. Of course, Helen stepped aside, noting how they entered like a united front, shoulders aligned, eyes focused. The living room she'd found so peaceful moments ago suddenly felt like contested territory. I made tea, she offered, grasping at Normal social conventions. "We're not here for tea, Grandma," Cassie said, her voice trembling slightly. She hadn't removed her coat, a signal this wasn't meant to be a lengthy, comfortable visit. Diana placed a hand on Cassie's arm, a gesture that seemed more about restraint than comfort. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened today." Helen sat in her armchair, Frank's chair, really, but she'd claimed it after his death, finding some comfort in the worn upholstery that still held the shape of him. "You mean my conversation with James?" "You went behind my back," Cassie's composure cracked, tears threatening. "You deliberately turned James against my wedding plans." "That's not what happened," Helen replied, keeping her voice level. "James already had concerns. We simply discovered we shared them." "Concerns?" Diana interjected, stepping further into the room. "About what? Spending money on Cassie's happiness? You have plenty of money just sitting in accounts, Mom. It's not like you're using it for anything else." The words landed like a slap. Helen's spine stiffened as realization dawned. "You've been discussing my finances with Cassie?" Diana at least had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. "We're family." Cassie had questions about how much help you could realistically provide. "So you showed her my personal financial information? Information I shared with you in confidence when you helped me set up my online banking?" The betrayal cut deeper than Helen had anticipated. "Don't make this about privacy, Mom," Diana countered, her voice taking on the slightly condescending tone she'd perfected after years of soothing difficult clients. "This is about family supporting each other. After everything Cassie's been through with Ryan—" "I'm right here," Cassie interrupted. "And this isn't about Dad. This is about Grandma promising to help with my wedding and then secretly meeting with James to convince him it's too expensive." Helen folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. "I never said I wouldn't help. I simply expressed concern about the escalating costs. $150,000 is what my wedding costs," Cassie finished for her. "That's the reality of getting married today, Grandma. This isn't the 1970s when you could have a reception in the church basement with punch and cookies." The dismissal of her own modest wedding, a day Helen still counted among her happiest, stung. There's a middle ground between punch and cookies and imported orchids flown in from Thailand. Diana moved to the mantel, picking up a framed photo of Helen and Frank on their 40th anniversary. "Mom, you and Dad always said you were saving for the future. For us, this is that future." "We saved for our retirement," Helen corrected her. "To travel, to live comfortably, not to hoard money while your only granddaughter struggles to have the wedding she deserves." Diana replaced the photo with deliberate care. "Dad would have wanted Cassie to have a beautiful wedding." The invocation of Frank's wishes felt like sacred ground being trampled. Helen knew exactly what Frank would have said about spending $150,000 on a single day. His practical voice echoed in her mind. Madness, Helen girl. Pure madness. Cassie removed an envelope from her purse, placing it on the coffee table between them. "We've already booked the string quartet and the custom dance floor. They need final payment by next week." Helen stared at the envelope. "You booked them? Without discussing it with me first?" "We tried calling you yesterday, but you didn't answer," Diana explained, though Helen had no missed calls on her phone. "The quartet had another offer, and we had to move quickly." "How much?" Helen asked, her voice barely audible. $12,000, Cassie replied without hesitation. "But they're the best in the state. They played for the governor's daughter's wedding." The governor's daughter, mayor's daughter, always comparisons to other people's weddings, other people's displays of wealth and status. Helen felt suddenly exhausted. "I don't know if I can continue at this pace," she admitted. "My savings aren't unlimited." Diana moved to sit beside Cassie on the sofa, creating a physical barrier between Helen and her granddaughter. "Mom, let's be realistic. You have over $300,000 in your investment accounts. Your house is paid for. Your expenses are minimal. This wedding won't bankrupt you. The casual recitation of her net worth, information Helen had shared, with Diana only during a vulnerable moment after Frank's death, felt like another violation. It's not about bankruptcy, Helen tried to explain. It's about reasonable limits and respecting the value of money. This is about your granddaughter's happiness, Diana countered. After everything our family has been through, don't you think Cassie deserves one perfect day? Perfect. The word hung in the air between them. Helen looked at Cassie, really looked at her, and saw not the entitled bride the past months had revealed, but the little girl who'd hidden in Helen's closet crying after her parents' screaming matches. The teenager who'd moved in with Helen for a semester when Diana and Ryan's divorce turned their home toxic. The young woman determined to prove that she could succeed where her parents had failed. I want you to have a beautiful wedding, Helen said softly. But I'm concerned about what these expectations are doing to your relationship with James. He values different things. James will be fine, Cassie insisted, wiping away a tear. He just doesn't understand how important this is to me. Once he sees everything come together, he'll realize it was worth it. Helen doubted that. The conversation with James had revealed a fundamental value difference that wouldn't be resolved by string quartets and custom dance floors. But saying so now would only escalate the tension. I never meant to upset you, Helen offered, knowing retreat was her only option. Of course I'll help with these additional costs. The relief that washed over both Diana and Cassie's faces confirmed what Helen already suspected. This visit had never been about reconciliation, only about securing her continued financial support. Thank you, Grandma. Cassie moved to hug her, the gesture feeling hollow after the preceding confrontation. I knew you'd understand once we explained. They left shortly after, mission accomplished, harmony supposedly restored. Diana's parting comment, "We'll bring the updated vendor contracts next week," lingered in the air like a promissory note. When the door closed behind them, Helen remained motionless in Frank's chair, the silence of her home no longer comforting, but oppressive. Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf where she kept her keepsakes. With sudden determination, she crossed the room and pulled out the bottom drawer, retrieving a worn leather folder. The New Zealand travel brochures were faded now, some dating back 15 years to when she and Frank first planned their someday trip. Milford Sound, the glowworm caves, volcanic hot springs. She traced her finger over a map of hiking trails they'd marked, remembering Frank's excitement about seeing landscapes from the Lord of the Rings films. We'll go when we retire, he'd promised, when we have the time to really see it all. But time had run out for Frank. And now, Helen realized as she stared at the brochures, money was running out for her dream of completing the journey for both of them. She'd always prided herself on her backbone, the English teacher who could quiet a rowdy classroom with a raised eyebrow, the wife who'd stood firm beside Frank through difficult years. When had she become this person who couldn't say no to her own family, even when their demands threatened to consume everything she'd saved for herself? Outside, Diana's BMW backed out of the driveway. Helen watched the taillights disappear down the street, taking with them another piece of her dwindling independence. I appreciate you meeting me here instead of the office, Miranda said, her professional demeanor slightly softened by the casual setting of the cafe. 6 weeks before the wedding, the normally poised wedding planner had suggested this unexpected private meeting, selecting a location deliberately far from her downtown office. Helen stirred her tea, noting the way Miranda checked the door each time it opened. Is everything all right with the wedding plans? Miranda's manicured fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on her leather portfolio. Mrs. Williams, I've been in this business for 15 years. I pride myself on discretion and client satisfaction. She paused, conflict evident in her expression. But I'm also bound by certain professional ethics. Helen set down her spoon. What's happened? There have been additions to the wedding that weren't part of our agreed-upon budget discussions. Miranda opened her portfolio, revealing a spreadsheet with highlighted sections. These items were added in the past 3 weeks. Helen scanned the document, her stomach tightening. Specialty lighting installation, $8,200. Custom monogrammed ice sculpture, $3,500. Vintage Rolls-Royce rental, $4,800. I never approved these, Helen said, her voice barely audible. No, Miranda confirmed. Cassie requested them directly, instructing vendors to send the invoices to you through my office. When I suggested consulting you first, she assured me you'd already verbally approved everything. Her expression conveyed the truth. She knew that wasn't the case. Why are you telling me this now? Helen asked. Miranda closed her portfolio carefully. In my experience, weddings reveal fundamental truths about families. Money problems become relationship problems, and… She hesitated. I've seen too many parents and grandparents deplete their savings for weddings, only to face hardship later. Across town, in the sleek cafeteria of his tech company, James picked at his salad while Olivia Santos listened intently, her dark eyes thoughtful beneath sharply cut bangs. I feel like I'm losing her, Liv, James confessed. Every time I try to discuss the budget, Cassie accuses me of not supporting her dream wedding. He pushed aside his barely touched lunch. Last night, she said maybe I'm not the right person for her if I can't understand how important this day is. Olivia winced. That doesn't sound like the Cassie I know. Doesn't it, though? James countered. You've known her longer than I have. This perfectionism, this need to have everything just right, it's always been there. But the wedding has amplified it to a level I don't recognize. It's complicated, Olivia acknowledged. After her parents' divorce, Cassie developed this idea that if she could just create the perfect life, the perfect relationship, she'd never experience that kind of pain again. But Helen's the one paying the price, James said, his voice dropping lower. Literally. She's spent over $100,000 already, and there's no end in sight. Olivia's expression shifted to surprise. 100,000? That can't be right. Cassie told me her grandmother offered 25,000, and she and Diana were covering the rest. James let out a hollow laugh. That's news to me, and to Helen. The following afternoon, Helen opened her door to find Olivia, standing on her porch looking uncharacteristically nervous. Mrs. Williams, Olivia began, I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all. Helen welcomed her inside, noting how Olivia's gaze lingered on the family photographs. Unlike Cassie's high-powered marketing career, Olivia had chosen nonprofit work. Her practical nature always a welcome counterbalance to Cassie's more extravagant tendencies. I had lunch with James yesterday, Olivia stated directly once they were seated. He's deeply concerned about the wedding expenses and how they're affecting you. Helen appreciated the young woman's straightforwardness. James is right to be concerned. Is it true that you've already spent over $100,000? More than that now, Helen confirmed, with the recent additions I just discovered. Olivia's expression fell. Mrs. Williams, Cassie told me you offered a fixed amount, $25,000, and that she and Diana were handling the rest. The revelation shouldn't have shocked Helen, yet it did. That's not accurate. I was afraid of that. Olivia twisted her hands in her lap. Look, I love Cassie. She's been my best friend since college, but she's not being honest with any of us about this wedding. She hesitated before continuing. I think she's trying to create this perfect event to prove something to herself, to her father, to everyone who witnessed her parents' marriage fall apart. But it's gotten out of control. Helen studied the young woman before her, loyal enough to love Cassie, honest enough to speak uncomfortable truths. Why are you telling me this? Because someone needs to stop this before it goes too far, Olivia replied simply. And you're the only one Cassie might actually listen to. That evening, Helen spread her financial documents across Bethany's dining room table. Bank statements, investment reports, retirement accounts. The complete picture of her financial life laid bare under the harsh light of scrutiny. Good Lord, Bethany muttered, calculator in hand. The deposits alone total $122,000. And there are still outstanding invoices, Helen added, her voice hollow. Miranda estimates another $30,000 to $40,000 by the wedding date. Bethany adjusted her reading glasses, scrutinizing the statements from Helen's investment accounts. You've withdrawn nearly 40% of your total retirement savings in the past 4 months. She looked up sharply. Helen, this isn't sustainable. I know. The simple admission felt like surrender. What about your pension? Bethany asked. How much of that are you living on? Almost all of it, Helen confessed. The investments were meant to be my cushion, for emergencies, for travel. Her voice trailed off. For New Zealand, Bethany finished for her. The trip you and Frank planned for 40 years. Helen nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Have you calculated how these withdrawals will affect your long-term financial security? Bethany's question was gentle but insistent. I've been avoiding it, Helen admitted. Afraid of what I'll find. Bethany reached across the table, her hand covering Helen's. Then it's time to stop avoiding and start facing reality. You need to meet with your financial advisor immediately. Helen stared down at the papers before her, the tangible evidence of her dwindling security. The numbers told a story she'd been refusing to read, each withdrawal a sentence in a narrative of diminishing independence. What if it's too late? She whispered. What if I've already damaged my financial future beyond repair? Then you need to know that, Bethany replied firmly. And you need to stop the bleeding before it gets worse. In the quiet of Bethany's dining room, surrounded by the stark reality of her financial situation, Helen felt something shift inside her. Resignation hardening into resolve. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about her dignity, her future, her right to the life she and Frank had worked decades to secure. I'll call Walter first thing tomorrow, she said, referring to her financial advisor of 20 years. I need to understand exactly where I stand before the next vendor meeting. Bethany nodded approvingly. And then? And then, Helen said, her voice finding its strength. I'm going to have to do something I should have done months ago. Set some boundaries that cannot be crossed. As she gathered the papers into neat stacks, Helen recognized the weight that was settling on her shoulders. Not just the burden of financial strain, but the heavier responsibility of confronting those she loved most, with truths they didn't want to hear. Let me be direct, Helen, Walter Pearson said, removing his reading glasses. If this spending continues, you'll deplete your retirement savings within 3 years. Helen stared at the colorful graphs on the financial advisor's tablet. Red lines plunging downward, projections that made her stomach clench. Walter had been managing her investments since Frank's death, his grandfatherly demeanor usually comforting. Today, his concern felt like an indictment. The withdrawals in the past 4 months have dramatically altered your financial trajectory, he continued, sliding a printout across his desk. You've taken out nearly 40% of your principal. That's money that should be generating income for your daily living expenses. Helen studied the paper, the numbers confirming what she'd feared. What does this mean for my long-term security? Walter leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Best case scenario, assuming no additional major expenses and modest market returns, you'll need to reduce your monthly budget by approximately 30% to maintain solvency through your expected lifetime. And worst case? Helen forced herself to ask. Worst case? Walter's pause carried weight. You'd need to sell your home within 5 to 7 years and significantly downsize. The words landed like physical blows. The home where she and Frank had raised Diana, where Cassie had spent summers and school breaks, where every corner held memories of the life they'd built. "I understand," Helen said, her resolve hardening. "No additional wedding expenses." Later that afternoon, Helen moved methodically around her kitchen, preparing the family dinner she'd arranged. Pot roast, Diana's favorite from childhood, homemade rolls. Cassie always said no one made them like her grandmother, a small gesture of love before the difficult conversation to come. The doorbell rang precisely at 6. James arrived first, a bottle of wine in one hand, flowers in the other. His eyes met Helen's with understanding. He knew what this evening would entail. Diana and Cassie arrived minutes later, their chatter about final wedding details filling the house with nervous energy. Helen noticed how James kept a slight distance from Cassie, their recent tensions evident in the space between them. "Everything smells amazing, Mom," Diana enthused, helping transfer dishes to the dining room table. "What's the occasion?" "Family time," Helen replied simply. "We haven't had a proper dinner together in weeks." They settled into their places, Helen at the head of the table where Frank once sat. The early conversation remained safely neutral. James's work project, Diana's new listing, the unseasonably warm weather. Helen waited until they'd finished the main course before clearing her throat. "I need to discuss something important with all of you," she began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I met with my financial advisor this morning. The wedding expenses have placed me in a difficult position." The atmosphere shifted immediately. Cassie's posture stiffened while Diana's smile froze in place. "What do you mean?" Cassie asked, her voice lifting with forced lightness. "I mean, I've already spent $128,000 on this wedding, and I will not, spend any more." Helen's voice remained steady, though her heart raced. "Any additional expenses will need to be covered by other means." Silence stretched across the table. James studied his water glass while Diana and Cassie exchanged glances. "But there are still so many things we haven't finalized," Cassie finally said. "The farewell brunch venue, the welcome bags. For out-of-town guests, those will need to be scaled back or eliminated," Helen interrupted gently. "I'm not trying to ruin anything, Cassie. I'm simply stating a financial reality." "I thought you wanted to help," Diana interjected, the familiar note of accusation creeping into her voice. "You promised to support Cassie's wedding." "And I have, far beyond what I initially intended or could afford," Helen replied. "Walter showed me the projections today. If I continue at this pace, I'll be forced to sell my home within a few years." "That's ridiculous," Diana scoffed. "You're being dramatic." Before Helen could respond, the doorbell rang again. James rose. "I'll get it." Patricia Duncan swept into the dining room moments later, her entrance perfectly timed for maximum impact. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, though she hadn't been invited. Ronald's board meeting ran long, and the traffic was simply brutal. Her gaze swept over the remains of dinner. "Oh, am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Diana said quickly, shooting Helen a warning glance. "We were just talking about some wedding details." Patricia hung her designer coat over a chair back, helping herself to wine without asking. "Wonderful. I just confirmed the ice sculptor this morning. He's the same artist who created that magnificent swan for the governor's New Year's gala." Helen's hands tightened around her napkin. "Patricia, I was just explaining that there will be no additional expenditures for the wedding. The budget has been exhausted." Patricia's perfectly shaped eyebrows arched upward. "Exhausted? But we haven't even finalized the welcome bags or the farewell brunch." "There won't be welcome bags," Helen stated firmly, "or a farewell brunch." "Don't be absurd," Patricia waved dismissively. Of course there will be. Every proper wedding has these things. What will people think? I don't care what people think, Helen replied, her patience fraying. I care about not bankrupting myself for a single day of celebration. Grandma, please, Cassie's voice cracked with emotion. This is my only wedding. My one chance to have something perfect. Perfect doesn't need to cost another $50,000, Helen countered. It does if you want to do things properly, Patricia interjected. Really, Helen, after all these years of saving, this is hardly the time to become miserly. Diana tells me you have quite substantial investments. The casual mention of her finances, yet another betrayal of her privacy, was the final straw. Diana has no idea what I have or don't have, Helen snapped, her composure finally breaking. None of you do. You see a widow with a paid-off house and assume I'm sitting on a fortune that I'm selfishly hoarding. Mom, that's not fair, Diana began. Fair? Helen cut her off. Was it fair when you discussed my personal finances with Cassie? When you both showed up here to manipulate me into continuing to fund this endless parade of extravagances? When you made me feel like a terrible grandmother for wanting some financial security in my remaining years? The room fell silent as Helen rose from her chair, her hands trembling but her voice finding strength. I have spent $128,000 on this wedding. Money that Frank and I saved for 40 years. Money that was meant to fund the trip to New Zealand we planned together. A dream I promised him I'd fulfill even after he was gone. Her voice caught. I've given up that dream to give you yours, Cassie. And it's still not enough. Tears spilled down Cassie's cheeks. I didn't know about New Zealand. You never asked, Helen replied softly. None of you ever asked what I might be sacrificing. You just saw an ATM with a grandmother's face. Patricia sniffed. Well, this is all rather dramatic, isn't it? If you couldn't afford to help with the wedding, you should have said so from the beginning. Patricia, for once in your life, shut up, Helen said, the words slipping out before she could catch them. Diana gasped as Patricia's mouth fell open in shock. You've never contributed a penny to this wedding, Helen continued, decades of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. You've only added expense after expense, raising expectations while opening my wallet wider. Also, you can brag to your country club friends about your niece's lavish wedding that you had absolutely nothing to do with financing. I will not be spoken to this way, Patricia sputtered, reaching for her coat. Diana, are you coming? Diana's gaze darted between her mother and her sister, the eternal peacemaker caught in an impossible position. We should all calm down and talk about this rationally. There's nothing more to discuss, Helen said quietly. I've already given everything I can. The rest is up to you. Patricia stormed out, the front door slamming behind her. Cassie sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. You've ruined everything, she whispered, the words aimed at Helen like daggers. No, Cassie, James finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. Your grandmother has been incredibly generous. More than generous. This isn't about ruining anything. It's about facing reality. What would you know about it? Cassie rounded on him. Your parents don't even care enough to contribute anything meaningful. James flinched as if struck. Without another word, he placed his napkin on the table and walked out, the soft click of the front door a stark contrast to Patricia's dramatic exit. Diana led a sobbing Cassie from the table, murmuring comforting words that made no promises. Helen remained seated, suddenly too exhausted to move. The dining room, filled with family moments ago, now echoed with painful silence. Her phone buzzed on the sideboard, a text from Olivia. Can we meet tomorrow about the bridal shower? I have some concerns I'd like to discuss privately. Helen stared at the message, too drained to feel anything but a dull sense of dread about What new wedding crisis awaited her? The shower, yet another expense, yet another expectation. The house creaked and settled around her, as if adjusting to the weight of all that had been revealed. "Just wait until you see it, Grandma." Cassie's voice bubbled with excitement as they entered Elysium Bridal, the upscale boutique where a simple veil cost more than Helen's entire wedding dress had in 1969. 3 days had passed since the disastrous family dinner, yet Cassie behaved as if nothing had happened, her emotional resilience both impressive and disturbing. Helen nodded politely to the boutique owner, a rail-thin woman who air-kissed Diana and Patricia like old friends. The shop smelled of champagne and expensive perfume, with plush white seating arranged around a small platform where brides-to-be could display their selections. "Mrs. Williams, we're so excited to show you Cassie's final choice," the owner cooed. "She looks absolutely ethereal." "Final choice?" Helen asked carefully. "I thought the dress was selected months ago." Flicker of discomfort crossed Diana's face. Patricia suddenly became engrossed in examining a beaded headpiece. "Cassie found something more suited to the venue's grandeur," the owner explained, ushering them toward a private fitting area. "Sometimes the perfect dress reveals itself later in the process." Helen's internal alarm bells rang as she took a seat on the white velvet sofa. The original dress had cost nearly $9,000, already an amount that had made her wince. What could "more suited to the venue's grandeur" possibly mean? When Cassie emerged from behind the curtain, Helen's breath caught, partly from the undeniable beauty of the gown, and partly from the immediate certainty that it cost significantly more than the original. Cascading layers of hand-embroidered lace flowed from a tightly beaded bodice, the train extending several feet behind her. Thousands of crystals caught the boutique's carefully positioned lighting, creating an effect that did indeed seem ethereal. "What do you think?" Cassie asked, her eyes wide with vulnerability that made Helen hesitate. "You look beautiful," Helen said truthfully. "But I thought you were in love with the first dress." "This is Marchesa," Diana interjected, as if the designer's name explained everything. "When it unexpectedly became available at a trunk show last month, I told Cassie she had to at least try it. It's the same dress the British Earl's daughter wore in Vogue last spring," Patricia added, inspecting the beadwork with appreciative eyes. "Simply exquisite craftsmanship." Helen took a steadying breath. "And the cost difference?" "The room." Temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Just 12,000 more," Cassie said quickly. "But they're giving us a deal because I'm relinquishing rights to the original dress." 12,000, Helen repeated, her voice hollow. "I knew you'd understand how special this is," Diana cut in smoothly. "I told Cassie, Grandma won't mind once she sees you in it." The presumption left Helen momentarily speechless. Before she could respond, the boutique owner reappeared with champagne flutes for everyone except Helen, who received a knowing glance and a cup of tea instead. "To the most beautiful bride," Patricia toasted, "and to the grandmother whose generosity makes it all possible." Helen raised her teacup mechanically, watching Cassie twirl in $12,000 of additional expense that she had explicitly stated she could not afford. The betrayal burned deeper than anger, settling into a cold, hard certainty that nothing she said would ever be enough. Later that afternoon, Helen met Olivia at a small cafe near the park. The younger woman looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her napkin as they exchanged pleasantries. "Thank you for meeting me," Olivia finally said. "I wanted to discuss the bridal shower before things get any more complicated." "More complicated than a $12,000 dress upgrade I just discovered?" Helen asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Olivia winced. "So they did go through with that. I was afraid they might." She pulled out her tablet, opening a document titled Cassie's Bridal Shower, Final Plans. "As maid of honor, I'm supposed to be planning this, but Diana and Patricia have basically taken over," she explained. "They've booked the rooftop at the Belvedere for next Saturday." Helen scanned the details: champagne fountain, gourmet food stations, hired string duo, custom floral arrangements, monogrammed favors for each guest. This looks like a wedding reception, not a shower. It's excessive, Olivia agreed quietly. But when I suggested something simpler, Diana said not to worry about the cost because… She hesitated. Because Mom will handle it, Helen finished for her. Olivia nodded miserably. I thought you should know before the invoices start arriving. They've already put deposits down, but the bulk of the payment is due day of. Helen's hand tightened around her teacup. Approximately how much? Just under 9,000. The figure hardly surprised her anymore. Nothing did. That evening, Helen laid out her cards across Bethany's kitchen table, their weekly game providing the only normalcy in a week that felt increasingly surreal. A $21,000 dress, Bethany repeated incredulously after Helen recounted the day's events. That's more than my first new car. Mine too, Helen said, discarding a 7 of clubs. And a $9,000 bridal shower I'm apparently hosting without having been consulted. Bethany studied her friend's face. You've reached your limit, haven't you? Beyond it, Helen confirmed. I've tried reasoning. I've tried setting boundaries. I've tried explaining my financial situation. Nothing works. So what will you do? Bethany asked, reshuffling the deck. Helen was silent for a long moment. I'm not sure. But I know I can't continue being treated like an ATM with no feelings or needs of my own. Late that night, Helen sat at her kitchen table with a gift card she'd purchased for the bridal shower, a modest amount for a kitchenware store Cassie had registered with. The small white gift tag stared up at her, blank and waiting. She thought of the dress fitting, the shower plans, the dismissal of her financial concerns, the constant expectation that she would simply write another check, sacrifice more of her, security and dreams, all without complaint or recognition. Something inside her, a small, defiant voice that sounded remarkably like Frank's, whispered that enough was enough. Her pen hovered over the tag, hesitating. Then, with swift, decisive strokes, she wrote, "From the ATM who's funding this." Helen stared at the words, her heart racing. Was this childish? Petty? Or was it the only language they might finally understand? She slipped the tag into its envelope, sealing it before she could reconsider. As she placed it beside her purse, for Saturday's shower, a strange mixture of dread and liberation washed over her. For the first time in months, she'd expressed her true feelings, even if only on a small rectangle of cardstock. Helen climbed the stairs to her bedroom, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake or finally taken the first step toward reclaiming herself. Patricia Duncan's home resembled a wedding venue more than a private residence. Situated in the exclusive Lakeview Heights neighborhood, the colonial mansion boasted manicured grounds, a circular driveway currently lined with luxury vehicles, and today, a front entrance festooned with blush pink roses and silver balloons. Helen parked her modest sedan behind a gleaming Range Rover, checking her appearance one last time in the rearview mirror. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a navy dress she'd worn to faculty dinners, respectable but deliberately understated. The wrapped gift card sat on the passenger seat, its innocuous appearance belying the loaded message within. For a brief moment, Helen considered turning around and driving home. Her finger hovered over the small white tag, wondering if she could still replace it with something benign. But then she remembered the dress fitting, the shower planning, the constant dismissal of her concerns. She tucked the gift under her arm and walked toward the entrance, where a young woman in black attire checked her name against an iPad guest list. "Mrs. Williams, welcome. The celebration is on the terrace." Inside, Patricia's home was a monument to conspicuous wealth, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, artwork Helen suspected cost more than her entire house. The terrace had been transformed into a floral wonderland, with arrangements Helen recognized from the premium selection at the I.D. florist they'd visited months ago. Helen, darling! Patricia air-kissed both cheeks, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the afternoon light. Isn't it just perfect? Cassie's friends are simply enchanted. Helen nodded, scanning the crowd, young women in expensive sundresses, a few older relatives, Diana flitting between groups with practiced hostess charm. Olivia stood near the gift table, looking uncomfortable in the extravagance. "You've outdone yourself," Helen replied, the understatement deliberate. Champagne flowed freely, servers circulated with trays of canapes, and a string duo played in the corner. Helen estimated the cost of this simple shower had already exceeded what she'd spent on Diana's entire wedding 30 years ago. After an hour of strained small talk and watching Cassie open gifts of crystal, silver, and designer linens, Helen felt increasingly out of place. Each extravagant present was met with exclamations of delight and photographed for social media by a professional photographer Patricia had hired. "And now from Grandma Helen," Diana announced, handing Cassie the modestly wrapped package that looked plain among the elaborate gift bags and boxes. Cassie smiled warmly at Helen. "Grandma always gives the most thoughtful gifts," she told the gathering genuine affection, in her voice that made Helen's stomach twist with sudden doubt. The envelope contained a gift card to an upscale kitchenware store, generous by normal standards but modest compared to the day's other offerings. Cassie held it up with a smile, then looked at the attached tag. "From the ATM who's funding this." She read aloud, her voice faltering as the words registered. The terrace fell silent. Champagne flutes paused midway to lips. The string duo continued playing for several awkward measures, before noticing the shift in atmosphere and trailing off into uncomfortable quiet. Cassie's face flushed deep red, her eyes filling with tears as she stared at the small white card. Grandma? Helen hadn't anticipated how exposed she would feel in this moment, how 20 pairs of eyes would turn to her with expressions ranging from shock to pity to morbid curiosity. Diana moved swiftly to Cassie's side, her face a mask of controlled panic. "Perhaps we should continue with the next gift." "Well," Patricia's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife. "I suppose passive aggression is easier than honest conversation." How very middle class. The cruelty of the remark hung in the air. Several guests looked down, embarrassed to witness such a raw family moment. "Mother!" Diana hissed, but the damage was done. Cassie's composure crumbled. "Entirely. Is that what you think of me?" she asked Helen, tears now flowing freely. "That I've just been using you like some ATM?" Before Helen could respond, Cassie stood abruptly, the gift card fluttering to the ground as she fled inside. Diana shot Helen a look of pure betrayal before following her daughter. The shower disintegrated into awkward clusters of whispering guests. Patricia moved among them, her voice carrying just enough for Helen to catch fragments. "No idea what's gotten into her. Always been a bit tight with money. Poor Cassie. On today of all days." Helen remained frozen in her chair, a strange mixture of regret and vindication washing over her. She hadn't wanted to hurt Cassie. Not really. She'd wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged. But the public humiliation hadn't been her intention. Through the French doors, she watched Cassie sobbing in the formal living room, Diana's arm around her shoulders. The scene reminded her painfully of consoling Cassie after her parents' divorce. The same hunched shoulders, the same devastated expression. "Mrs. Williams?" James stood beside her chair, his arrival earlier than expected. His expression was unreadable as he surveyed the disintegrating party. "I think I've made a terrible mistake," Helen said quietly. James nodded toward the garden path that wound away from the terrace. "Perhaps we could talk for a moment, away from the audience." They walked in silence past immaculate hedges and stone fountains until reaching a small gazebo partially hidden by flowering trees, safe from Patricia's surveillance and the guests' curious eyes. I heard what happened, James said finally. One of Cassie's friends texted her that you'd caused a scene. I came early. Helen sank onto the gazebo bench. I shouldn't have done it, not publicly at least. No, James agreed, but I understand why you did. He sat beside her, his posture suggesting a man trying to find words for a complex situation. This wedding has become something none of us recognized until it was too late. A symbol rather than a celebration. I've tried talking to them, Helen said. Setting boundaries. Nothing worked. Because this isn't really about money, James replied, his insight surprising her. It's about what the money represents. To Cassie, it's validation that her marriage matters when her parents didn't. To Diana, it's compensation for what she couldn't provide after Ryan left. To Patricia, it's another chance to showcase her social standing. Helen studied the young man beside her, seeing Frank's practical wisdom in his assessment. And to you? To me, it's become a test I'm failing, he admitted. My parents taught me that marriage is about partnership, shared values, mutual respect. This process has made me question whether Cassie and I truly want the same life. The honesty of his answer resonated with Helen. Frank would have liked you, she said simply. I think we need to clear the air, James continued. All of us. Before this wedding happens. If it happens. If? Helen hadn't considered that possibility. Cassie and I have some fundamental issues to resolve, James said carefully. But first, your relationship with her needs healing. He hesitated. Would you be willing to meet with my parents? They could host a family discussion. Neutral territory, where everyone might actually listen. The suggestion surprised Helen. Your parents. They've been married 42 years. They understand family conflict, cultural differences, money tensions, and they respect elders in a way that… He trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. As they walked back toward the house, Helen saw Cassie being ushered to Patricia's SUV, Diana's arm protectively around her shoulders. Neither looked in her direction. I'll text you details, James said quietly. For tomorrow, if possible, before positions harden further. The drive home passed in a blur, Helen's mind replaying the moment Cassie's face crumpled as she read those 7 damning words. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from relatives and friends who'd been at the shower, most expressing shock or disappointment. Diana had sent 3 texts, each more cutting than the last, culminating in, "How could you humiliate her like that, after everything she's been through?" But one message stood out among the others. James. My parents will host everyone tomorrow at 2 p.m. Address to follow. This can be fixed, but only if we're all honest with each other. Helen set the phone aside, wondering if some fractures ran too deep for honesty alone to heal. The Chen family home stood in stark contrast to Patricia's mansion, a modest 2-story in a middle-class neighborhood, impeccably maintained but without pretension. Potted orchids bloomed in the windows, and delicate calligraphy scrolls adorned walls otherwise devoted to family photographs. Helen noticed immediately that many images featured elderly relatives prominently displayed at eye level, a subtle but significant cultural statement. Wei-Chen, James's father, greeted Helen at the door with a respectful bow. Mrs. Williams, welcome to our home. Please come in. Inside, Helen found Diana and Cassie already seated in the living room, their postures stiff with unresolved tension. Neither had spoken to her since yesterday's shower disaster. James stood by the fireplace, his expression serious but determined. Lin Chen, a petite woman with observant eyes and an air of quiet authority, entered carrying a wooden tray with an ornate teapot and small cups. Before we speak of difficult things, she said, her accented English deliberate and clear, we share tea. This is our tradition. She knelt gracefully at the low table. In our culture, the tea ceremony reminds us that even bitter medicine goes down easier when offered with respect. Helen watched as Lynn prepared the tea with practiced movements, the ritual creating a moment of calm before the inevitable storm. When Lynn handed Helen the first cup, a gesture James later explained signified respect for the eldest present, Helen felt a small crack in her resentment. Once everyone held their tea, Wei spoke. James has told us of the wedding difficulties. In our family, we believe problems should be discussed openly, with all voices heard. He looked at each person in turn. Who would like to begin? The room fell silent, the gentle ticking of a wall clock marking uncomfortable seconds. I will, James finally said. I love Cassie, and I want to marry her. But this wedding has become something I don't recognize, something that doesn't reflect our values or our future together. Cassie stared into her teacup, a tear slipping down her cheek. Cassie? Wei prompted gently. I just wanted everything to be perfect, she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought if the wedding was perfect enough, maybe the marriage would be too. Lynn leaned forward slightly. Perfect how, child? Not like my parents, Cassie admitted, the words tumbling out as if long contained. Their wedding was small. Budget. Dad complained about it for years. Said it showed Mom didn't value him enough. She looked up, tears flowing freely now. Every fight they had, he'd bring up that cheap wedding like it was proof they were doomed from the start. Diana flinched visibly. Cassie, I had no idea he said those things to you. All the time, Cassie confirmed. And then when he left, when he just replaced us. I promised myself that when I got married, no one would ever be able to say it wasn't good enough, that I didn't try hard enough. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. I thought if I could just make everything perfect, James would never leave me like Dad left Mom. The raw confession hung in the air. James moved to Cassie's side, taking her hand but remaining silent, allowing the moment to unfold. Wei nodded thoughtfully. In our tradition, we say the most elaborate banquet cannot make bitter hearts sweet, nor can the simplest meal make loving hearts grow cold. I contributed to this, Diana said quietly. After Ryan left, after the divorce destroyed our finances, I couldn't give Cassie the life she was used to, the life Patricia's children had. She looked at Helen directly for the first time. When you offered to help with the wedding, Mom, I saw it as Cassie's chance to have something special after all she'd lost. I didn't consider what it might cost you, not just financially. Why didn't you tell me about New Zealand? Cassie asked Helen, her voice small. Helen sighed deeply. Because I didn't want to burden you with my dreams when you were so focused on your own. She set her teacup down carefully. But that's where I went wrong. I should have been honest. From the beginning about what I could afford, what I was sacrificing. Instead, I let resentment build until it poisoned everything. Lynn poured more tea, the gentle ritual creating space for difficult truths. In our family, she said, children care for parents as parents once cared for children. This is not burden but balance. She looked pointedly at Diana. When elder wisdom is ignored, the whole family tree becomes unstable. Diana nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. I should have protected you, Mom. Instead, I used your generosity to compensate for my own failures with Cassie. Helen reached across the table, taking Diana's hand. We both failed to set proper boundaries. I wanted to be the grandmother who could give Cassie everything, perhaps to make up for the times I was too busy grading papers to attend every school event when you were growing up. That's not true, Diana protested. You were always there when it mattered. As you have been for Cassie, Helen acknowledged. But somewhere along the way, we confused financial support with love. James's father cleared his throat. When I married Lynn, we had a simple ceremony in her parents' backyard. My father gave us a red envelope with $200. All. He could afford after putting my brothers through college. He smiled at his son. The wedding lasts a day. The marriage must last a lifetime. Which deserves more investment? The question resonated in the quiet room. I don't need Lakeside Manor, Cassie said finally, looking at James. I don't need $21,000 of lace and crystal. I just need you. She turned to Helen. And I need my grandmother, not her money. The damage I've done to your savings, Diana began, but Helen shook her head. What's done is done. We move forward from here. Wei Chen nodded approvingly. The Chinese character for crisis also contains the character for opportunity. This difficulty has created space for necessary truth. As the afternoon light shifted, through the windows, casting warm patterns across the room, the conversation continued, practical now, focused on scaled-back wedding plans, reasonable budgets, shared responsibilities. James's parents occasionally offered quiet wisdom, but largely allowed the family to find their own way through the reconciliation. When it was time to leave, Helen felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not that everything was solved, but that healing had begun. I'd like to invite all of you to my home next Saturday, she said at the door. There's something important I want to share with you. We'll be there, James promised, his arm around Cassie's waist. Diana hesitated. Mom, about Patricia. We'll discuss that another time, Helen said firmly. This is about our family first. As Helen drove home, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of possibility. She fingered the small key in her pocket, the one that unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk, where New Zealand waited. Sunlight filtered through cherry blossoms, casting dappled shadows across the community botanical gardens. White chairs arranged in intimate semicircles faced a simple wooden arch draped with wildflowers and greenery. A string quartet played, softly as guests found their seats, the music floating on the spring breeze rather than amplified by expensive sound systems. Helen smoothed her pale blue dress, purchased years ago for a faculty retirement dinner, not bought new for this occasion, and took in the scene with quiet appreciation. 6 weeks of honest conversations, scaled-back plans, and rediscovered priorities had transformed Cassie and James's wedding from a financial spectacle to something far more valuable, an authentic celebration. Quite different from what we once imagined, isn't it? Diana said, joining Helen on the stone pathway that served as an impromptu greeting area. Better, Helen replied simply. The garden pavilion visible through the trees had been transformed into a reception space with market lights strung overhead, wildflower centerpieces on wooden tables, and handwritten place cards. Helen had contributed $15,000 to this revised wedding, a reasonable sum that acknowledged her role as grandmother without compromising her future. The remaining expenses were shared between the couple, Diana, and James's parents, creating a true family collaboration. Miranda, the BA wedding planner, approached with a tablet in hand. Mrs. Williams, everything is proceeding perfectly. Cassie wanted me to tell you the photographer is ready whenever you'd like family photos. Helen noted how Miranda's typically sales-driven demeanor had softened since the budget reset. Perhaps the planner had found relief in the simplification as well. Helen, Bethany called, navigating the garden path with careful steps. This place is magnificent, much better than that gaudy ballroom. More meaningful, too, Helen agreed. Frank proposed to me in a garden not unlike this one. A subtle shift in the crowd's energy signaled a new arrival. Ryan Reynolds stood awkwardly at the garden entrance, his much younger wife Stephanie clutching his arm. His gift, a check Helen suspected was still for the same $2,000, protruded from his breast pocket, visible evidence of his minimal contribution. Diana straightened her shoulders and moved to greet them, her posture relaxed, but dignified. Helen watched with quiet pride as her daughter directed Ryan to his seat. Not in the front row with immediate family, but in the appropriate second row that acknowledged his relation without granting him unearned prominence. The ceremony itself held a simplicity that highlighted what truly mattered. When Cassie appeared at the garden entrance, her dress was the original selection. Beautiful but not extravagant, altered slightly to better suit the outdoor setting. Her smile, directed first at James and then finding Helen in the front row, carried a genuine joy that no amount of imported orchids or crystal chandeliers could have enhanced. Marriage, the officiant began, is not about perfect moments, but perfect commitment through imperfect times. Helen found herself reaching for Diana's hand as James and Cassie exchanged vows they had written themselves, honest promises that acknowledged challenges alongside joys. When James spoke of building a life based on shared values, not shared appearances, Helen caught Wei-Chen's approving nod from across the aisle. Later, as twilight descended on the reception, fairy lights twinkled overhead like earthbound stars. The cake, a simple 3-tier design rather than the 7-tier spectacle originally planned, was cut with laughter rather than photographic precision. Dancing took place on the pavilion's existing stone floor, not on imported Italian marble. During the toasts, Cassie stood, champagne flute in hand, her eyes finding Helen's across the room. "I want to thank someone very special," she began, her voice carrying emotion but also newfound strength. "My grandmother taught me that a marriage is built on honesty, even when that honesty is difficult to hear." She paused, collecting herself. "6 weeks ago, I thought she was trying to ruin my perfect wedding. Now I understand she was trying to save something far more precious, our relationship." Helen felt tears threatening as Cassie continued. "Grandma Helen showed me that true love isn't measured in dollar signs, but in the courage to speak difficult truths. She sacrificed her own dreams to support mine, and it's time we honored hers." Diana joined her daughter, followed by James, the 3 of them forming a united front. "We'd like to invite Helen Williams to share her plans with everyone," Diana announced, gesturing for Helen to join them. Surprised, Helen made her way to the small wooden platform. "As many of you know," she began, her voice steady despite the unexpected attention, "my late husband Frank and I always dreamed of traveling to New Zealand. Life and responsibilities postponed that dream, but I'm happy to announce that 3 months from today, I'll finally be making that journey in Frank's MRI." Applause rippled through the gathering, led enthusiastically by Bethany. "What Grandma doesn't know," Cassie interjected with a conspiratorial smile, "is that while scaling back our wedding plans, we've been creating a different fund altogether." She produced an envelope. "This is from all of us, my mother, James, and me, his parents, and even some of Mom's real estate colleagues who've heard about your dream trip." Helen opened the envelope with trembling fingers to find a substantial travel voucher and a handwritten note. "For the woman who taught us the difference between price and value. Your wisdom shouldn't cost you your dreams," James added. "This is our small way of restoring what was nearly lost." As evening deepened, Helen found herself approached by Wei-Chen, his hand extended in invitation as the quartet began a waltz. "In my country," he said with a formal bow, "it is a great honor to dance with the family elder." They moved across the stone pavilion, their steps finding easy rhythm despite never having danced together before. "You have a remarkable grandson-in-law," Helen observed. Wei nodded, pride evident in his expression. "James sees the value of harmony, but not at the expense of truth. This makes a strong foundation for your granddaughter." Across the dance floor, Helen spotted Diana sharing a civilized but brief conversation with Ryan, her posture revealing neither bitterness nor longing, simply the composed dignity of someone who had found her own strength. Near the dessert table, Bethany chatted animatedly with Lin Chen, the 2 women discovering shared interests despite different backgrounds. When Cassie prepared to toss her bouquet, Bethany found herself unexpectedly in its path, her surprised expression when catching it causing laughter to ripple through the gathering. As the evening concluded, Helen watched Cassie and James depart in his sensibly priced hybrid, rather than the vintage Rolls-Royce once deemed essential. The assembled guests waved sparklers that illuminated the night with golden light, more beautiful in their simplicity than the elaborate fireworks display originally planned. Back at her seat, Helen reached for her purse and found a small package that hadn't been there earlier. Inside was a New Zealand travel guide, its pages already, marked with sticky notes highlighting hiking trails, cultural sites, and scenic viewpoints. A handwritten note was tucked inside the front cover. To new adventures for both of us. Thank you for teaching me what really matters. Love, Cassie. Helen traced Frank's initials she'd carved into her wedding band decades ago, a private gesture, connecting past to present. You'd be proud of her, she whispered to his memory, of all of them. The golden glow of market lights reflected off the simple gold band, a circle unbroken, like the family that had nearly fractured but instead had found its way back to what truly mattered. Not the price tag of celebration, but the value of honest love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.